tiredness of PUE, my main reason for not liking it so much is because it's become such a marketing tool and it's very easy to manipulate it in order to get as low of a result as you're after.
You're listening to Green.io, the podcast of responsible technologists making our digital world greener, one bite at a time. I'm your host, Gaël Duez, and I invite you to meet a wide range of guests working in the tech industry to help you better understand and make sense of its sustainability issues and find inspiration to positively impact our digital world. If you like the podcast, please give it 5 stars and a nice review on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite platform to spread the word to the millions of people working in the digital sector. And now, enjoy the show. Hello everyone! In this episode, we go to both France to meet Benoit and Sweden, from where we welcome Stanislava to talk about sustainability in the data centers industry. When I first met Benoit in Paris, at a cafe, having a nice lunch under a cool summer day, I know it's cliché, but it's true. He told me a sentence which has stuck in my mind since now on. Does anyone actually read the figures in these reports? And he did so because A, I was actually guilty at that time of over-consuming reports on green IT, a field which I had just discovered, and not paying attention enough to the data and the methodology underlying them. And B, I told myself, whoa, this guy knows what he talks about. And indeed, Benoit, having co-founded both Hubblo and the NGO Boavizta after almost a decade working as a cloud and sysadmin engineer, knows what he talks about. It's actually pretty easy to double-check because everything he produces is open data and open source. 2 values he cherishes, but we'll come back to this point later. Stani was introduced to me thanks to Chris Adams, the director of the Green Web Foundation, when we were discussing life cycle assessment. His word: she is one of the most knowledgeable on this topic. Which makes total sense knowing that after her Master of Science in Industrial Ecology, she joined the Research Institute of Sweden to study, LCA, applied to data centers. She has now moved toward an expert lifecycle position at IVL, but stays close to the data center field via her involvement in the SDA, the Sustainable Digital Infrastructure Alliance, among other things. Welcome, Stani and Benoit. Thanks a lot for joining Green.io today.
Hi Gaël, thanks for having us.
Hi.
So, before jumping into the nitty-gritty of data centers' environmental impact, my first question is always about your personal journey in the sustainability area. So, Stani, how did you become interested in sustainability and in the sustainability of our digital sector in the first place?
Thank you for asking. I think one of the most powerful experiences that actually led me to join sustainability field was an exposition that I went to with my high school. And I remember hearing about what issues we're facing and how possibly people in 50 years or so would have to ration water because there would not be enough clean water anymore. And I remember that being very scary and very strange to think of. And potentially that was too powerful to do something about at that time, so I sort of let it be. And I started studying international business instead. But as I was going through all the courses on accounting and finance and marketing, I thought there was something missing to that, and I thought there had to be something more. So that's why I actually selected to follow an elective on sustainable business. And at some point I started to think to myself, yes, this is very interesting, this is how things should go. But at the same time, how do I know that what the companies are saying is actually true? How can I verify that they actually are sustainable and it's not just some claims? So that then led me to the masters that you've already mentioned in the beginning, industrial ecology, where I learned how to quantify this sort of business behavior and impact. And after a few years of working as a consultant in IE, in industrial ecology, I joined RISE, Research Institutes of Sweden, and that's how I got introduced to the data center industry. It was maybe a bit of a coincidence and a happy accident, because I was not very involved in that before, but I had worked in technology, so there was an interest. And after that, I've realized that there is so much, it's such a huge heterogeneous industry, and so much can be done regarding sustainability on so many different levels. And I'm happy to be still involved.
So that's funny because it all started with water. And actually, I believe water is a topic we will discuss regarding sustainability in the data center industry. And what about you, Benoit? How did you come involved in sustainability and all this work you've done in green IT?
I can't remember about a very specific event that drove me there. I think I've worked in IT like many other people, not really realizing what was behind in terms of impact, because I didn't realize at first that our modern societies had such an impact on the environment, and that it was really a problem for the future. So I realized that piece by piece, very progressively, and I changed many things in my personal life so I could feel aligned with what we should do for the future. And so I started working on my own thing, actually. I was working on cloud infrastructures at that time. And I thought, okay, if I have to start somewhere, I should start on my own problems, my own impact. So first, how is it big? How could I evaluate this impact? And my first answer was like, oh, that seemed like super complicated. So I found work from the INRIA, which is a research lab in France. I found some projects about it, but nothing that I could use directly in my own context. So I don't really know why, but rather than staying the company, I pretty quickly thought that I had to leave and to work on this topic as much as I could. And so I started developing a software for measuring the power consumption of servers, of IT servers. Then I happened to be discussing with people who were building an ONG from scratch. So I started discussing with them, and then you have Boavizta. And then later I realized that there was some demand for the work I've done on the software. And then I said to myself, okay, maybe there could be a business here, so I could work on this topic 100% of my time, so I don't have to find a new job in like 1 year. And so you have Hubblo, and that's how I came to the topic.
So synchronizing a bit more what you've already started to do in your personal life with what you can do and the expertise you already had in your professional life.
Yeah, that was the idea.
Okay. And, I spotted very recently a discussion in the climate action tech community about an article that I must admit I forgot the title, who had quite a lot of debate about the number of data centers worldwide. It was stated that we have already 7.2 million data centers worldwide and 3 million in the US. Some people finding it quite consistent, some people finding it completely crazy, this number. And then it connected me with one of the first topic we discussed with Stani a few months ago, actually, which was her ontology. Let's define properly what is a data center, what is a hyperscaler, what is an enterprise data center, colocation data center, etc. And I would love, Stani, if you could help us set the stage a bit regarding the data center landscape. What are we talking about? What are the main numbers? And how would you actually explain this controversy regarding the number of data centers. And I will not enter into the other controversy about the number of servers, because I think it will take half a day to talk about this one.
Well, I'll try to do my best. Indeed, it's very hard to measure and to count how many data centers there are, because you can have a data center at your own company, which is a very small closet with a few servers. And technically that counts as a data center. But to sort of distinguish between the main groups of data centers, and of course you can complement what I say, Benoit, I would say that you have enterprise data centers, which are the data centers owned by the companies themselves to have their own data on. Then there are colocation data centers, which are such data centers that external companies own. And then if you have the need to store your data somewhere, but you don't want to do it in-house, you rent some space and then you just populate it with your servers and then you store your data there. And finally, you have the so-called hyperscalers, which are the large companies such as Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft that own their own data centers, even develop their own servers and technology, rent out parts, and are just very big, which is why they're called hyperscalers.
And so, depending the definition, the 7.2 millions could make sense or not. I mean, if we picture ourselves a data center being, there's massive facilities that you can see from the sky, which belongs to Google or Amazon. Obviously, there is not 7.2 millions worldwide. But if you include what you've labeled enterprise data centers and colocation data centers, do you believe such a number could be correct?
Yeah, I think it's possible, especially if we think of all the small data centers, 1 rack or 2 racks. I can imagine it could be that much.
Okay, so let's now enter the main topic of our episode today, which is sustainability in data centers. So for the sake of clarity, let's put aside cloud for the moment. I mean, obviously, everything that we're going to start discussing regarding enterprise data centers or colocation data centers will at some point apply to your cloud service providers. However, you don't interact directly with metrics or the electricity consumption, etc., etc. But truth is, there are still millions of companies interacting one way or the other with data centers and not having migrated to the public cloud or private cloud or whatever. And my question would be, what can you concretely do when you're in charge of a data center, you're a head of infrastructure, you're obviously a CTO, a CIO. How can you run a greener data center? And maybe, I think, Stani, once again, you told me once about PUE fatigue, that you were a bit fed up with everything focusing only on PUE. So could you elaborate a bit on what would be your main advices, your main insights on how to green your data center operations?
Sure. So maybe just to mention about this tiredness of PUE, I think my main reason for not liking it so much is because it's become such a marketing tool and it's very easy to manipulate it in order to get as low of a result as you're after. And at the same time, it's just a ratio, so it doesn't actually tell you how much power you are consuming. So instead, I've been thinking really how to classify it. You are in this data center industry and what you can do. So I started with the colocation level to think what are the options there, because the main difference is that you oftentimes do not own the servers. So you cannot do anything regarding lots of the equipment, but what you can do is you can ensure that you have a supply of renewable energy. Ideally, you would be producing it yourself, but if not, then at least you're purchasing it from someone. You could try to motivate your clients to be more efficient, maybe by providing them data on where the majority of energy consumption takes place in real time, so that they can adjust it accordingly. Then, of course, you can try to reuse waste heat in lots of different applications in industrial symbiosis. You could decrease your water use, build your building sustainably, because that is something you have a lot of power over, and reuse as much material as possible, not just in the building, but also in the installations that you do have control over. And then if we go further to the enterprise data center, then of course you have much more possibility to green your data center, because then of course you're even running your own servers and you're probably writing your own program. So then you could still follow the previous steps, and at the same time you could purchase equipment that can be used longer, especially when it comes to servers that contain so many rare earth materials that have a huge impact when it comes to just their mining and production. You could refurbish these servers and then reuse them. What is interesting, I've been hearing how the increase in performance between different generations of servers has decreased. So it's possible to refurbish an older server to an almost same performance as the new generation has, and thus avoid purchasing new. You could try to motivate your IT team to write efficient code. And something that also has a huge impact is to understand what data is essential and needs to be immediately backed up in case something happens, and therefore it needs redundancy. And on the other hand, what data can just wait for a few hours if there's a power outage and it does not need this redundancy. Because what we see a lot right now is that data centers are building twice or three times the redundancy, meaning that they have twice or three times the amount of the equipment that they need, just in case there is an outage of power or something other happens. And that is very important in certain cases. Let's say if you are a data center behind a hospital, then of course you don't want to lose anything for any time. But if you're just storing email or some pictures, then maybe you can wait for an hour or so before you power everything up again. And when it comes to the hyperscalers, what we already see is that they are trying to even build their own equipment. So I think what they can do on top of all of this is to innovate, make even better equipment, and then actually reuse their own equipment. Because what is slightly sad in my experience is that they oftentimes just donate their own equipment or resell it at some secondary markets. So I think a point of improvement there would be to actually keep it in-house, refurbish it, and then use it themselves.
Well, that's very interesting, because you mentioned not only energy consumption, obviously, which is a big part of the environmental impact, but you started to mention minerals, resources at large, water. Are these all the ingredients that come into what is your area of expertise, which is a life cycle assessment? Or is it something a bit different?
No, I would say that you expressed it quite correctly. It's all of these bits and pieces and ingredients that all come together. And although at the moment there's this obsession with the energy use, of course energy use is very important, but I think we shouldn't forget everything else that is involved, because at some point those things have a large impact as well.
Okay, thanks. That makes total sense. And Benoit, switching to a very operational mode, you recently told me that via Hubblo, you run a full LCA for a CTO, but you're under NDA, so we will not mention neither the company nor him. But could you describe a bit what was the process? More specifically, the process involving hosting, infrastructure, etc., etc.
How the process works, usually, if we address this topic at the company level, it might take into account the workplace as well. So most of the time, we have like a consultancy role where we try to assess the impacts of IT as a whole in the company. So this is very a manual process. This is based on LCA principles. We try to isolate the hotspots of impact, so the huge parts of the impact, before we can zoom on specific parts and try to have a more fine-grained approach. When we realized that the IT services is the most important part, which is not always the case, then we could assess those impacts not only by, let's say, human-made LCAs, but also with software that could help us to automate the process and make the evaluation easier, repeatable, help the company to be as autonomous as possible and not depending on us to reproduce the evaluation. The idea being that they could evaluate the progress, are they going to the right direction or not? And so one of our objectives is to become as useless as possible in this process. So it really depends, but for sure, if IT services are a big part of the topic for this company, then we could help to automate the inventory of the machines, which is very, very often a pain point, because in theory, all companies have a great CMDB that's up to date with all the information about all the hardware involved in the service. In practice, that's almost never the case, except a few companies that are very, very cautious about that and that put a lot of efforts in this area. Then you have the questions of what are the impacts of this service, and Stani mentioned it. When we are in IT, we think a lot about energy, we think a lot about electricity, but that's just a part of the equation. And to illustrate a bit this point, based on what Stani said, she mentioned like lifetime of the machines, refresh cycles. That's something we see often, like companies who say, it's okay, we can reduce our energy consumption just by buying new servers that are less energy consuming for the same workload as compared to the previous generation of machines. If you just look at energy consumption, at final energy consumption, that approach might work, maybe, depends, but possible. But as soon as you try to evaluate and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, then this is much more complicated. Not to say that most of the time it doesn't work. For a very simple reason is that most of the time the greenhouse gas emissions due to the manufacturing of the new machines just jeopardize your attempt to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions on the long run, because the manufacturing has a huge part, and the impact of usage may be not that important if you look at the manufacturing part. So this is especially true in countries where you are lucky to have a low carbon intensity regarding electricity that you consume. Of course, usage phase will be much more important in countries where the carbon intensity is higher. But yeah, so this kind of questions, and also how we assess the other impacts, the other criterion impacts, and Stani mentioned minerals and metals. That's one of them.
Going back to what you talked about, the carbon emitted during the manufacturing phase of the equipment, I believe it is called embedded carbon. Where do you get the information?
That's a whole topic there. So for a long time, it has been that you had only one choice, which was, do you have access to a database where you have impact factors, so constants that you could apply in your calculations to estimate this part of the impact. This is still the case, but I feel like the field is evolving piece by piece, because before you were forced to pay license fees to get those those data. That that was not the best scenario to democratize impact evaluation and involving companies to take action. So that's one of the topics we worked on in Boavizta, and the first attempt we made was to aggregate all the manufacturing impact data we could get from the manufacturers. So it takes the form of an open database now. Basically, we have some scripts scrolling the manufacturers' web pages to get the right PDF files. That's as simple as that. And we aggregate the data in a database that you can query. So that's interesting, and it gives you some insights about like, let's say, orders of magnitude of the impact of manufacturing a server or a laptop or a screen and so on. But the thing is that you can't really use that database for evaluation, because from one product to another, let's say you take 24-inch screen in, let's say, manufacturer A and a 24-inch screen in manufacturer for manufacturer B. The methodologies to evaluate the impact are most of the time not the same. So it could be almost the same product. You could have different impacts, and sometimes the differences are huge. So it's not a good basis, I guess, for evaluation. So we work on another project, which is an API, where we try to have an approach where you are less dependent on databases. And how we do that, it's based on scientific papers, mostly from OCO Institute and Fraunhofer Institute in Germany, where you can have the impact of one semiconductor, let's say the smallest unit in terms of manufacturing IT components. So because it's what's inside the component, you can then calculate what's the impact of the component. And then if you can calculate the impact of several components, you can calculate the impact of a machine, and so on and so on. So that's an open source database as well. That's an open source API, sorry. But yeah, so how do you calculate? At some point you need data. At least what is a bit changing now is that you kind of have, it's not perfect yet, but you kind of have access to data without being a consultancy company that has a lot of money to put in acquiring those data.
But are you telling me that the only source of open data, actually, the only provider of open data when it comes to embedded carbon is now Boavizta with the API?
No, I wouldn't say that, because I don't necessarily know all the initiatives on the topic. There is also, for example, I discussed a bit with people from the CEDACI project, who I think have a lot of interesting data as well. I didn't see how the data is publicized, but that's an example, and I think there are other projects on the run. So no, the idea is not to say, hey, Boavizta is the only way to get open access data and free of, let's say, with a free license. But to say that it's one of the huge topic, at least we encourage other organizations to provide data. We encourage manufacturers to open more data, because in the beginning that's a bit silly that you have to build up that kind of project on your own. Like, if you have proper regulation, you would have manufacturers providing data on methodologies that we could understand or that we could verify in some way, and then we would be super happy, and it would be way easier to evaluate the impact of ICT, because we would have data from the ground up. So of course, it's not the manufacturer himself who does the evaluation. It's a company specialized in that topic, but it's a company that, because it is working with the manufacturer, has direct access to all the proxy metrics and insights it needs to make a proper evaluation, which is much, much, much harder when you try to do it afterwards and you have to work with aggregated data that you don't know the source.
Kind of retro-engineering the carbon footprint of an equipment once it has been built.
Yeah, that's a bit about that.
Okay. And that being said, Benoit, I have one last question, because there are two things that you say that were really music to my ears. The first one, being a bit selfish, is when you mentioned that you want to be as useless as possible, as soon as possible when you work with a company. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I say to my clients when I do consulting with them. I want you to make me redundant as much as possible. It's more on the green IT strategy or digital sustainability strategy, but that's something that I was like, you sometimes look at me and say, why? And I'm very happy that you've got the same pitch, because I really believe that this is what a good consultant should be looking at, become redundant as soon as possible. But that being said, sorry, it was another topic that I really loved, is the case for automation. And you mentioned that you try to automate measure as much as possible. Could you drop some names or give us an example of how you do that?
Yeah, what we try to do, so that the Boavizta API, you can find it on GitHub, is great to evaluate the impact of manufacturing, especially of the servers, but could be some other context as well. And on top of that, we build several tools. So there is a tool called Bo Agents, which purpose is to scan the hardware of a machine, ask the right questions to the API, and so it aggregates the manufacturing impact of this machine as a monitoring metric. So you can get that in your monitoring tools as you use in a day-to-day basis. I mean, every company running IT services, they have monitoring. This agent is also connected to another tool, which is Hubblo tool this time, but as always, it's open source, Apache 2 license, which is a scaffold. I think I mentioned it in the beginning of the discussion. It's about measuring the power and so energy consumption of servers. And so the agent, because it's connected to both the API for manufacturing and scaffold for the usage phase, it can aggregate the impact numbers of the machine on the almost the full life cycle, because we still lack good methodologies and data for let's say the end of life, for example. That's something that's missing. On top of that, there are also other projects. There's a project in Boavizta called Cloud Scanner that will scan your AWS account for all the EC2 instances and give you an evaluation of the impact, including manufacturing, so usage and manufacturing. This is also based on the API. So that's really an ecosystem. That's, let's say, a toolbox, and depending on your context, depending if you are on on-premise machines, on cloud services, or something else, you could select one tool or another, or several of them. We are also working on continuous integration chains for development team. So you can have in your, let's say, your GitLab CI evaluation of impact for the products you are developing, to see from one release to another, you seem to have reduced the potential impact of your application when it will be in production, or if you have made things worse. So that's an example. That's the kind of thing we are.
It relates to the run a more efficient code that Stani mentioned at the very beginning of the episode. This CI/CD tool, is it the one related to the SDIA?
Absolutely, that's the project we are building with the SDIA. So Boavizta and the SDIA talk a lot to each other because we really like what they do, and I think they like what we do. And so we work on this topic together. I know people that Stani knows, but we discovered that thanks to your podcast.
This is why I love running this podcast. And Stani, do you have maybe a success story or just an example of how using this tool has helped developers or, I don't know, an agile team or whatever to reduce their footprint?
Unfortunately, not. I do not really have any success stories because I think it's pretty small scale so far. But definitely there is a growing interest in knowing the impact of computing and doing something about it. It's just that we're at a pretty early stage, I would say. Gaël, could I mention something? I started thinking of this water when Benoit was talking, but then I didn't want to jump in.
Sure.
So when it comes to the water usage and the WUE, water usage effectiveness that Benoit has touched upon, I think one of the problems in the ratio itself is that it doesn't tell you how much water is consumed in total. And then similarly, and this is also linked to the LCA methodology, is that even if you knew how much water they consume in total, it's very hard to link it to the location, the region where this happens in all these assessments, because maybe using a huge quantity of water in one country would not be such a problem because they have an abundance of water, while using it somewhere with little water available could be rather critical. So that's another problem that we face.
Localization is key. Let's save the last part of our discussion to talk about cloud. And I could be a bit the devil advocate here, or a bit provocative, saying, yeah, but why don't we move everything into the cloud? Because if I read Google, Amazon, or Microsoft newspaper, detailing the very same environmental impact that the two of you just mentioned during this episode, it seems to be way more efficient to mutualize everything in big public cloud or hybrid cloud or whatever, rather than running data centers on-premise or even colocation data center. Is it something that you agree with or not?
Well, if I can start, I would say I don't really agree with it, because at the end of the day, a cloud is not really a cloud in the sky. It's actually located somewhere physically. So you can't just move everything to the cloud, because still it needs to be built somewhere and it needs to be operated somewhere. What I have read from one of these hyperscalers was that they achieve around 90% emission reduction by moving to cloud. But then when you look into that further, it's because they're comparing this with some average data center with rather low efficiencies and pretty bad environmental impact. So I think it's not really that a cloud is so good. It's just that they have made the data centers that operate this cloud more efficient. So you could stay on a physical data center elsewhere, not on the cloud, and just improve your metrics and still have the same impact then as this great cloud.
So yeah, to jump on this one, I kind of agree with Stani, and we wrote a blog post on the Boavizta blog, especially on the papers that hyperscalers are showing off regarding potential of impact reduction when you move your workload from an on-premise data center to the cloud. And yeah, the numbers are calculated on very, very advantageous scenarios. But then there are several variables in this equation, let's say. So yeah, the cloud in theory and sometimes in practice can have good parts, good sides, like If you mutualize resources for more services, as you mentioned, you can also, thanks to the APIs and the thing that everything is an API in the cloud, you can use resources exactly when you need it. That's something that could be done in an on-premise data center, but it's sometimes harder because you need more R&D and more workforce to build tools that make you control the resources as finely as it's made in the cloud. So that's, let's say, this advocates for the cloud, because you could often see in on-premise data centers having several tens or hundreds of servers running 24/7 because they are waiting for the Black Friday. That's something that you shouldn't have in the cloud, because you have all the tools necessary to just consume those resources when you need them, when the traffic goes higher. But that's like, let's say, like really the technical part. On the other side, moving a workload from on-premise to the cloud, most of the time it doesn't happen in one night. So you have kind of a double run. Your service still runs in the on-premise data centers until it's fully satisfying in the cloud. So you have two services for some time. If it lasts long, you could just, let's say, double your impact. So not really what you were looking for in the first place. But let's say, okay, it's not an issue anymore. We are super effective in moving the workloads in the cloud. Thing is that there is a very different approach from consuming resources in on-premise data centers to consuming them in the cloud. In an on-premise data center, you have to order new machines if you want to deploy a new project. In the cloud, you just have to click or make an API call, but that's super fast, super easy. I've already been in companies where, when we looked at the bills at the end of the month, you had clusters of data management that were accounting for, I think it was 15K for the month, and it was just a dev environment that was forgotten. So this hardly happens in an on-premise data center, because deploying resources is much harder. So you remember about it. So that's the full story of FinOps for sure. But in terms of environmental impacts, it has some importance as well. So today, I guess we can do some evaluations of service on the cloud. That happens, we do it, but we do it on, let's say, it's a fixed picture. It's like, today, the impact of the service is this. But it's very hard to estimate and to show projections on, okay, but now that you are in the cloud, your service will inflate. It will consume more and more resources, because people working in your company will have access to those resources very easily. And it will open the door for many projects. So some of them would be very useful, but maybe you would also have new projects just because you can do them. So yeah, that's a full question that's, in my opinion, goes way beyond the only evaluation about impact in the cloud and what's the difference between a cloud provider and, let's say, a more classic hosting scenario.
So once again, a multi-criteria approach is needed to answer properly the question, and there is no like simple and straightforward answer.
Yeah, multi-criteria, so that you don't shift impacts from one area to another. That's one thing, but it's also about consequential approach and consequential analysis, and not just analyzing the today's picture of the impact. And that's maybe the hardest part. I think maybe even harder than having a proper multi-criteria approach. It's really, this dynamic view of the impact and the relation between companies' activity and what the impact will be in the future.
If I may add, I think what is also very important with these studies and impact and multi-criteria assessments and so on is to be very transparent, because we have seen lots of new reports or new marketing strategies being published, but they almost never mention what their assumptions are. And of course, the results are going to be very different if you assume that you're, let's say, consuming only green energy and you're very efficient in comparison to if you maybe looked at the slightly more pessimistic scenario.
Thank you so much, Stani, because actually I realized that when we were discussing transparency issues, both regarding the access to open data, but also the access to what methodology has been used, etc., I actually wanted to ask you this question. And also, so thanks a lot for bringing this topic before we close the podcast. And could you maybe provide just one example of an assumption that if you change it, will change dramatically the result? Something that you've noticed in your life as a researcher?
Well, for instance, just selecting the source of energy would have a very big impact. Even if it was green energy, it could have different impact if it was in different countries. Or, for instance, if we look at the colocation data centers, and it's quite popular to be examining the impact of the building. You just take a flow of concrete in these different databases, and if you know nothing about it, there are so many different flows to choose from, which represent different manufacturing practices, different, let's say, standard of concrete. Maybe you have some that is more durable or not, and the difference in results can be huge. They can be tenfold, if not even higher. So that's why it's very important to be able to rather easily find these main assumptions, how their study was built, just to understand what the results actually mean and if they are applicable to you or not, and if you would reproduce the same study, if you would get the same results or not.
Tenfold. That was the kind of order of magnitude that I wanted to know and to make sure that I got it right. So yeah, that huge impact regarding your methodology and the assumptions underlying it. Okay, so thanks a lot, both of you. You shared already tons of insights, a lot of references. I believe this is going to be one of the, top 5, if not top 3 episode when it comes to the length of the episode notes and all the references that will be put in it. Still, do you have 2 last references, thought leaders, something that you want to share with the listeners to know a bit better, to understand a bit better about the data center sustainability issues or potential solutions, or even in a broader way on the sustainability topics?
Maybe in a broader way, I would suggest reading, since I really like reading books. There are 2 that I can recommend. The first one is called The Best of Times, The Worst of Times, Futures from Frontiers of Climate Science by Paul Behrens. And what I specifically like about it is that it looks at different topics from both the optimistic and pessimistic perspective, and it gives you lots of references. And the second one, as someone who really likes to understand how things work, there has been a book written by KTH, the university in Stockholm, called Towards the Energy of the Future. And it tries to explain sort of what the challenges are, what is needed in a pretty low level so that anyone can read it and understand.
Yeah, maybe so not specifically on the cloud, but on the impacts of IT and its role reshaping our societies for a world that's stabilized at 1.5 degrees or less. I mentioned the work of Gauthier Roussy, which is a researcher in France. The report he made on challenging the assumptions of positive impact of ICT on the environment, Especially there are two reports, one from JZ, the other from GSMA. So it's interesting to see that they are very well written papers, peer-reviewed papers of amazing quality that nobody knows about. But papers from companies who have a clear and evident interest in showing one side of the story has echoes on top of the government. So I think it's really a key thing to understand.
Thanks a lot. That was a lot. I think you might even be a direct challenger to the episode with Chris Adams where we had, 25 references. I think it was a full episode dedicated to what shall I read, what shall I learn about the digital sustainability topics. But the good news, as you mentioned, Benoit, is that we have more and more literature. The topic is getting traction, and hopefully the scientific-based papers will get more traction rather than low-quality, scientifically speaking, communication papers. But so I want to thank both of you. We covered a lot. Actually, I think we could have spent another hour deep diving on, codes, green coding, how you do an LCA, really like hands-on approach, etc. But that will be a course, an area course, as you mentioned, Benoit, rather than a podcast episode. So thanks a lot, both of you. That was awesome to have you on the show.
Thank you too.
Thank you for having us.
And that's it. Thank you for listening to Green.io. Make sure to subscribe to the mailing list to stay up to date on new episodes. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to share it on social media or with any friends or colleagues who could benefit from it. As a non-profit podcast, we rely on you to spread the word. Last but not the least, if you know someone who would make a great guest, please send them my way so that we can make our digital world greener one bite at a time.